Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Jawad Tehami. Starting with Afghanistan, the Taliban have rejected calls for a ceasefire during Ramadan. President Ashraf Ghani had appealed to the group that they should lay down their arms during Ramadan so that the government can focus on fighting the COVID-19. Taliban, however, have said that such a call is irrational when the government itself is not executing its responsibilities. Earlier, U.S. envoy Zalmay Khalilzad had also urged the Taliban for a ceasefire, but the Taliban insist that the conditions as per the Doha peace deal must be met by the Afghan government. And to talk more about this particular thing and what is exactly out there in Afghanistan, we are joined by Mr. Pamir Patang, analyst and former advisor to the UK and the Afghan government, joining us from Kabul, and Professor Christian Kaunert, analyst and the director of the International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales, joining us from London. I'll start the discussion with you, Professor Kaunert. How legitimate do you think this refusal by the Taliban on the call of the President Ashraf Ghani is?
I think it's very clear. In order to achieve a peace deal, the Taliban have to lay down their arms. They have to agree to a ceasefire. I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is an expectation of trust. If the Afghan government is to trust them in their idea that they're going to work towards an actual peace deal, I think it's absolutely paramount that they're laying down their arms, that they're agreeing to a ceasefire. I think it's very, very difficult to get the Afghan government to trust them, that they're interested, in fact, in having a peace deal. Secondly, it's also in line with the United Nations. The United Nations have asked for a ceasefire across the entire world. So I think this makes it even more important in the context of Afghanistan, where there is this idea that we're moving towards a peace deal. I think this is even more important in this particular context to agree to a ceasefire. Now, obviously, we are not fully there yet in terms of a peace deal. And of course, the Afghan government was initially partially excluded from the negotiation. It was a direct negotiation with the US government. And I think this is one of the problems that we're still having with the negotiations. But I think in order to advance, it is vital that a ceasefire is agreed.
So, Professor, as you have already mentioned, that it was the US and the Taliban which signed the historic peace deal, and the Afghan government was not included just because of the fact that the Taliban didn't want to talk to them because they considered the Afghan government the puppet of the United States, and they wanted to have direct negotiations with the US. And now we see Ashraf Ghani asking the Taliban to lay down their arms. That's why the Taliban are insisting that the Afghan government should execute the preconditions of the intra-Afghan talks before they can ask the Taliban to lay down the arms for a complete ceasefire in the country.
Yes, indeed. I mean, this is something that is quite crucial for the talks. The Afghan government has felt that it was excluded from the beginning from these talks. And of course, the Taliban claim to have their reasons, and their reasons are of, as you rightly pointed out, that they see them as a puppet government. But of course, these were the people that were elected in the only free elections that we've had, and this has been since the fall of the Taliban. And you can quibble about how free those elections are, but historically there hadn't been free elections before that. And I think as a result of that, in order to be able to push forward in terms of a peace deal, I think a ceasefire is necessary. Otherwise, the Afghan government is always going to feel that its vital security interests are at stake in this so-called peace negotiations. They're not going to perceive it as a peace negotiations if there isn't a ceasefire.
So, Mr. Patang, I will you with this very point. On one side, we see the Afghan government saying that since it was not part of the historic peace deal that was signed between the US and the Taliban, hence it is not incumbent upon the Afghan government to fulfill all those conditions which were agreed between the US and the Taliban. Now we see Ashraf Ghani asking the Taliban and requesting them to lay down their arms. Don't you see a contradiction in this narrative?
I think the Afghan government had done whatever it was required to do. They have started releasing the prisoners, and they have showed a commitment for a dialogue, for an intra-Afghan dialogue, for a face-to-face dialogue with the Taliban. I think there are some inconsistencies from the Taliban side. Ever since the agreement was signed, we had over 2,500 attacks on the Afghan forces across the country. And whereas only a few hundred attacks had taken place from the Afghan side on the Taliban, and more or less it was a defense attacks. So prisoners were released. Of course, you are talking to a government that is internationally recognized. It has a judicial system in place. It has all the systems in place. They cannot just release prisoners from the cells just without having some procedures in place, taking assurances that they are not going to go back into the battlefields and fight the coalition and Afghan forces. And with regards to the Ramadan ceasefire that the president had called on the Taliban, I think it was the right call. The international community supported it. The U.S. has supported it. But my fear is that the Taliban think, or probably their fear is that if they do agree to the ceasefire, the government will use this as a tactic to rearm itself and to reposition itself, and then to have a greater attack on the Taliban. I don't think this will be the case, because there will be an international assurance given to the Taliban that no attacks will take place on the Taliban post-Ramadan. And we, on the other hand, we have also this COVID-19 issue that is spreading quite greatly across the country.
So, Mr. Patang, that particular point, the Taliban are insisting that those assurances which have been actually written in the peace agreement, first of all, those must be met, and later they would be talking about the other conditions or the assurances which might be urged by the international community, including the U.S. and even the Afghan government, particularly vis-a-vis Ramadan and the COVID-19 pandemic in the country.
I think the whole peace agreement should have been consulted in a much greater detail with the Afghan government before assurances to be given to release around 5,000 prisoners from Afghan prisons within 10 days. That is virtually not possible, and we knew it was not going to be possible, and it happened. It was evident. Most of over 2,500 prisoners were committed by all the courts in Afghanistan to various sentences. Those people who have been committed and their judicial papers that are over. Of course, the president has the right to pardon them and to release them from the prisons. But there are the remaining 2,500 people whose cases are still in process in courts. The president, virtually under the law, he does not have the right to release them because the process is not completed. So the courts have neither found them guilty nor sentenced them to. But of course, the government went against certain rules and start releasing even those who have not even had the final sentencing from the court. So there are some steps have been taken from the government side, whereas from the Taliban side, of course, one of the conditions was that to agree to the ceasefire. They have not fulfilled that, and we have noticed that, and the international community have been saying it, that over 2,500 attacks have taken place on the Afghan forces, and that shows that there are either the side or the other side is not fulfilling its commitments. Although Afghan government have not signed the agreement, so they have agreed based on either the pressure from the international community or honoring what the U.S. have signed and agreed to the Taliban.
So, Mr. Patang, as you said, there are a lot of legalities which are involved as far as the prisoner release is concerned. That is what actually was alluded by the National Security spokesperson Jawad Tehami as well. But does it depict or indicate a fact that during the negotiations with the Taliban and before signing the historic peace deal with the Taliban, the U.S. didn't take the Afghan government into confidence beforehand?
Yes. In the first place, the Afghan government should have been part of the talks. They should have been part of the agreement, and they were not. That is a big unfortunate. But still, the Afghan government, I think, in my view, have taken the right step to fulfill its obligation before the international community and to start releasing. although they could have rejected, they could have said that, no, we're not releasing because, this is not our agreement. This is a U.S. agreement, U.S.-Taliban agreement. So if the U.S. wants to release any of the prisoners, they can release them from Guantanamo Bay as well as Bagram prison that is controlled by them. So, but still, the Afghan government went against all its rules and regulations and started releasing. But the legality of release of the prisoners still remain a big challenge for the Afghan government and the whole judicial system.
Okay, Professor, when we talk in terms of two major developments in the world going on at the moment, there is, on one side, there is holy month of Ramadan, and the people expect peace during this particular holy month of Ramadan. That is why President Ashraf Ghani has called on the Taliban to lay down their arms, especially in the month of Ramadan. On the other side, when we talk about COVID-19 particularly, we had got the reports that the Taliban were proactively involved in making efforts to protect the people from the COVID-19, particularly in those areas where they have the hold. So do we consider it a contradiction that on one side they are aware of the fact that they should protect the civilians under their control from COVID-19, but on the other side, they are adamant of not laying down their arms just because of the fact that the Afghan government is not meeting its responsibilities and not laying down the arms in the month of Ramadan?
Yes, indeed. I think you've quite rightly said that there is an element of contradiction from both points of view. Whether you're talking about the COVID-19 crisis, it is absolutely vital that we have a ceasefire because, of course, as those fights are continuing, you're getting more and more people into danger of catching the virus and spreading it around the country. And in the end, it doesn't matter on which side of the fence you are, you're always going to be affected by the virus. And with the kind of health system as it is in Afghanistan, it is even more dangerous to the people. So I think from that perspective, it is absolutely vital to have a ceasefire. But even from the perspective of trying to push forward in terms of a peace agreement, if you're going to achieve lasting peace, it is vital to show that you can be trusted, that in fact you are serious about achieving peace. And it's not just about getting the United States to leave Afghanistan, but it's about establishing a society that is ready for peace, that is ready for a non-conflictual environment. And I think for this, it's also quite vital that that we have a ceasefire at the moment. I think there's many lives at stake here, and I think as a result of that, we really need to push forward with a ceasefire.
Okay, now with this very similar point, when we weigh the Taliban reaction to COVID-19 on one side, they are pretty much aware to protect the people in those areas which are under their control. Perhaps the target of that disease is common man. And on the other side, when they refuse to lay down their arms during the holy month of Ramadan, their target is not the common man, rather it is the Afghan security forces and the foreign forces. What do you say about it?
Taken by the Taliban, they are not taking it quite seriously. By calls from the international NGOs, local NGOs, that this issue is quite severe and it's spreading quite badly across the country. But the Taliban's fear, the Taliban's understanding is that no, well, this is the holy month of Ramadan and Allah is on our side, and therefore COVID-19 will not reach us. So they have been inconsistent throughout. Throughout the whole 2 decades of their war against, let's say, starting from fighting the Americans, the coalition forces, and then the Afghan government. Initially, their enemy was when President Karzai was in power, their enemy was the U.S. and the coalition forces. They were calling President Karzai as their brother, and they were saying that, no, we have nothing to do with the Afghan government. President Karzai is our brother, and therefore our fight is in jihad is against the U.S. and its partners. Whereas now they're in fruitful relationship, we can see, with the U.S. and some of the coalition partners. But on the other hand, then you have the Afghan government, the Afghans itself, as their enemy number one. So they have been inconsistent throughout the 2 decades of their policy and their war and their insurgency, we can call it as well. And but from what we see on the ground here in Kabul, and the Afghan government have been trying its best to do whatever it needs to do to honor their obligations and release of prisoners, it was one of the biggest signs that the Afghan government could show that yes, they are ready to sit down to the peace negotiations, to the intra-Afghan dialogue. But each time, either one time the Taliban would say that no, we don't recognize this delegation that is proposed by the Afghan government. Either they are too junior or too senior, or they don't represent. Well, it's none of their business. It's the delegation represents the Afghan government. It's approved by the Afghan government, and they should accept it. The Afghan government, I think, they will not reject or they will not object to the delegation that would be proposed by the Taliban. So each time, some sort of a reason or excuse the Taliban would come up with, and I think if they really want to show that they're ready to any type of negotiations, they should lay down their arms and respect the month of Ramadan, respect the people's feeling, and let people...
Mr. Patang, as you already mentioned, that there could be international assurances to the Taliban, especially when in terms of talking about them laying down their arms, particularly in the month of Ramadan, what those international assurances could be that could suffice the Taliban?
I think the U.S. Have already called on them. I think the U.S. can be as part of the assurance to this matter. The UN have called on it. The international community have called on all sides to hold on fighting. I mean, to stop fighting each other. The Afghan government have been making calls on the Taliban, but we have not had a single call from the Taliban to say that these are our conditions before we stop our fight during the month of Ramadan.
Okay, Mr. Pamir Patang, analyst and the former advisor to the UK and Afghan government, joined us from Kabul, and Professor Christian Kaunert, analyst and the director of the International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales, was joining us from London. Thank you, both of you gentlemen, for your time at Newswire. With this, we come to the end of the first segment of Newswire. In the second segment, we'll discuss the power struggle in Yemen. Right after a short break, stay tuned. Welcome back to Newswire. I'm Jawad Tehami. Yemen has been mired in violence since 2014. Over 100,000 people have been killed since then. The civil war that has brought the country to the brink of famine. In another sudden turn of events, the Southern Transitional Council, the STC, an ally of the Saudi-led coalition, announced emergency and self-governance on 26th of April. Both have fought together against the Houthis to take the southern provinces from the rebel group. Later on, fighting between both allies erupted once again, and in August last year, the STC captured and took control of the port city Aden. Later on, a power-sharing deal known as the Riyadh Agreement was signed between the internationally recognized government of President Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi and the STC with Saudi intervention. The STC has cited the government's mismanagement, corruption, and inability to deliver as the reason for their announcement of the self-rule. However, the government has warned the STC of catastrophic consequences of withdrawing from the deal. 5 provinces in the south have also refused to accept the self-rule declared by the STC. Now, will this announcement by the STC create a civil war within an already raging civil war? To talk more about this, we are joined today by Adel, Dashela researcher from Istanbul, and Mr. Guy Burton, Middle East expert from Brussels. Thank you for your time, both of you gentlemen. I'll start the discussion with you, Mr. Burton. Do you think once again the Yemen will be sliding into a civil war within an already raging civil war?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show again, Jawad. So what we have in Yemen at the moment is, as you pointed out, this declaration by the Southern Transitional Council, effectively causing a split between them and the government, which was already precarious because of the Riyadh Agreement. This is something that's been sort of ongoing for quite some time, since last summer at least. And I think in this instance, this is sort of, the latest salve. The Riyadh Agreement failed to be, fully implemented. Beginning in January, the implementation committees effectively came to an end. The STC pulled out of that. Following STC efforts to try and, reduce some of the release some of the prisoners, to allow some of the prime minister back into Aden. And from the government side, they saw nothing coming from that. So this is very much a sort of, again, a problem that's within Yemen. It sort of creates, as you point out, sort of, a civil war within a civil war. Of course, the Yemen conflict itself is multifaceted in a number of different ways, both at the national level, the local level, as well as the international level.
Okay, when we talk about the reasons which are put forth by the STC, they're of the view that the government was not able to deliver as per the Riyadh agreement, and the deadlines were also not met according to the Riyadh agreement. Do you think their reason is legitimate and they had the right to announce the self-rule?
Well, the Southern Transitional Council has long been a separatist organization. This hasn't come out of the blue. In effect, that the STC has been present there. There has been Southern separatist sentiment since Yemen itself was unified back in 1990. In fact, there was even a brief civil war in 1994, where sort of the former political elite of the former South Yemen sort of tried to split from Yemen itself. So there has been a strong separatist movement that's existed within the southern part of Yemen pretty much since the 1990s. What's happened is that the conflict that has come about since 2015 and has sort of brought these tensions much more into the open. And it also has been partly the result of sort of the international coalition which was backing the government. The UAE decision to pull back a bit last summer, made the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, a much more prominent figure, and that was the moment at which it took advantage and seized control of Aden. So this is not something that's come out of the blue. This is something that's been sort of percolating in the background. Although obviously there has been a lot more attention given, at least at the international level, to the conflict between the Houthis in the north of the country against the government itself.
Okay, Mr. Burton, come to the factor of Houthis in the north as well. The thing that you have just said is that it didn't happen out of the blue. It was actually brewing up from last many months. This is what exactly the spokesperson of STC also said, that this, let me quote him, this is not an event that just sprung out of nowhere. This is a pile-up of mismanagement, misgovernance, especially in South Yemen, which has been Houthi-less for 4 years now. Now, Mr. Dashela, can you comment on this? Does this particular claim or the accusation has any value or truth associated with it?
Thank you for having me. Let me, at the beginning, to tell you that the separatist organization in South Yemen all the time accused the Yemeni government of didn't provide the city of Aden and the southern areas with basic services like electricity, like medicine, and other services. Unfortunately, this is a kind of fabrication. This southern movement wants to impose its project on the southern areas by force, and this is unacceptable by all the local authorities in Hadramaut, in Shabwa, in Al-Mahra, and other areas. And I think that this is will not happen in next years or even in the future, because we have a lot of problems in South Yemen, in North Yemen. We have a lot of militias, a lot of armed groups in North Yemen, in South Yemen, and in the eastern part of Yemen, and at the same time in the western part. So situations are very difficult in Yemen. So I think that the best solution for all these problems is to implement the outcomes of the National Dialogue Conference. Without implementing these outcomes, I think that the civil war will happen in next month and in next years, or maybe in the next month. Because in South Yemen, at the same time, for example, now, the Southern Transitional Council, which is represented himself as a representative of the southern areas, is not from all governorates of South Yemen. This council is only from 3 governors, from Abala, from Lash, and some parts of Aden. So how can the people in southern Yemen accept this council? So it's a very difficult situation, and I think that because of the
Mr. Dashela, as you have just pointed out, that there are only 3 governments in the southern provinces. that accept the narrative of the STC of a separate rule or government in the southern provinces. So it would be a difficult thing for them to handle because 5 of the other provinces have refused to accept their announcement of the self-rule. Will it lead to more fighting in the southern provinces in the coming days?
Maybe, because if we look back to the history in the southern areas, we can see what had happened in 1986. There was a civil war between 2 parts in the South Yemen, and there was local war in these areas. And I think that it's very difficult just to, for example, to establish a new state in Aden for all areas in South Yemen, because for example, the region of Hadramaut now wants to establish new state. And the region of Al-Mahra wants to establish new state, and the governorate of Shaba wants to establish new state. Okay, it's very difficult to accept the transitional council to rule all these areas. And I told you that if the transitional councils just go ahead of escalation or military escalation, that means maybe civil war will happen between the southern people themselves, not between the south and the north.
Okay, Mr. Burton, I'll come to you with this point. When we talk about there are reports that there is no electricity, there is no water available to the common people in Yemen, and even there are reports of a very dilapidated sewage system. So in this particular situation, as Mr. Dashela just pointed out, that the STC just wants to have a separate state in the south, but keeping all those shortcomings which haven't been overcome by the government. Don't you think that the allies of the Riyadh Agreement or the other party of the Riyadh Agreement has the right to do whatever suits it the best for the welfare or the larger interest of the people in the south?
Well, certainly, I mean, the case has been in Yemen that, public services and the state of the public sector has been in a very poor situation for coming on for at least a decade, if not longer. And as a result, you have a political system in which, those who have control are able to sort of parcel out sort of services and patronage to those that support them. I mean, one of the big things that we've talked a little bit about, this challenge that the STC has made this announcement, and yes, as we've heard, there has been rejection by some of the governors in the south. This, I think, makes it worth pointing out that within Yemen itself, at a local level, we're not talking about at least at the national level, there's this idea that there's sort of 3 main governments competing with each other, whether it's the Hadi government, the official UN recognized one, or the STC one that has now announced itself, or the Houthis in the north of the country. But actually, underneath all of that, underpinning this is a patchwork of different militias who all control local, smaller parts of the country. And so any government or any aspiring government is going to have to cultivate and gain the support of that. And that also points to the fact that the nature of power at the moment in Yemen seems to come through the gun. So, it's going to be a big challenge for the STC to be able to win over the support of these militias in parts of the south, and B, to actually be a manager of public services. At the moment, much of its support is primarily within Aden. Whether it has much support beyond Aden and in the wider part of the south is going to be a question we're going to have to ask ourselves in the days and weeks ahead.
Okay, Mr. Burton, please stay with us. So we're now joined by Mr. Mohammed Alragawi, journalist in Yemen and media attaché in Ankara, joining us from Istanbul. Thank you for your time at Newswire. How do you see this announcement of the self-rule by the STC in Yemen? Would it escalate tensions in the already war-ravaged country?
Actually, what the STC announced is an unexpected step, and I think I'm expecting more violent actions on the ground in the coming days, because the legitimate government will not allow such things to happen on Aden, because this is exactly similar to what happened in last August, when the STC tried to control Aden, and the legitimate government also reacted to that violently, actually. So I'm expecting more violent actions on the ground in the coming days.
Okay, Mr. Alragawi, when we talk about port city of Aden, could you shed a little bit of light? What is the strategic importance of this and how the STC can take the leverage by using this particular port city to their advantage?
Actually, the importance of the Port of Aden is very important, not only to Yemen, but to the international community. And that's what the STC and the UAE actually is the one who is trying to control the Port of Aden, because the Port of Aden is very important for the international trade. And the STC, they are thinking if they control the port, they will be able to have a self-govern Aden and the surrounding areas. But I think the STC is mistaken in such thing, because what's coming from the port is not really enough to run the city of Aden. Let's put aside the whole southern governorates. The STC has done a big mistake in announcing such decision, and I think the coming days will show us.
Okay, Mr. Alragawi, you're of the view the STC has done a huge mistake by announcing the self-rule. Mr. Burton, when we come to the factor of Houthis in the north, what kind of leverage or the advantage they can take out of this escalating situation in the south? Would they start increasing their attacks towards the south?
Well, certainly the Houthis were sort of in conflict with the government, with the Hadi government in Aden. And certainly the Houthis have also been on the advance in the north, seeking to exploit their position there. But of course, there is a mixed debate within the Houthis about sort of how far they want to push it. Unlike the STC, they're not necessarily separatists, but what they are fighting for is greater autonomy for themselves, which is what brought them into conflict, both in the sort of the pre-2011 state, and also has brought them into sort of conflict with Saudi Arabia. But certainly the Houthis at the moment seem to be on the march in the north. They seem to be being at a position where they have the advantage. But of course, there's also the tension that if they try to advance too far, they may well overextend themselves, and they may also find themselves losing any kind of sort of broader support within the territories that they've taken under arms. So in that sense, that is a constraint for them to not advance too far beyond their sort of northern heartlands, so to speak.
Mr. Dashela, I'll come to you. When we talk about the strength of the internationally recognized government, do you think by this divorce between the two signatories of the Riyadh Agreement, the strength of that government will reduce, and there are now two fronts for this government to fight the war on?
In my opinion, the escalation by the Southern Council has come to end the Riyadh Agreement. And I think that the Saudi Arabia cannot implement this agreement in the next month, because these militias will not accept peace, and they want to implement their goal, which is independent state. Therefore, I think that it's very difficult for the Yemeni government to fight southern militias and the militias of Al-Houthi in the North Yemen.
So, Mr. Burton, it's a very important question when we talk about Yemen. Will it be divided into two separate countries again, as it was before the unification in 1990?
Well, certainly this is obviously what the Southern Transitional Council wants, but I don't know that there's a broad consensus, in the rest of the country for that at the moment. Certainly, the STC, or the Southern Separatists fought a civil war in 1994 because they sort of found themselves on the losing side after unification. They did not get the same degree of power sharing and power resources that they had then. Of course, that was now a quarter of a century ago. So Yemen itself, there will be a number of some in the population that will support the Southern Separatist movement. But of course, there is the wider population, which is not necessarily all in favor of that. Then, of course, we need to factor in the fact that there are a number of different militias that are operating at the local level, which the Southerners and the government itself needs to sort of win over to its cause. So it's by no means certain that this declaration is necessarily going to manifest itself in a separate state. There is still a long way off before that happens. And of course, there is the question of the wider international community. There is a certain sense in the international community to discourage secession, separatism, and so that may well be a factor that you find makes it difficult for the STC to make this happen on the ground. The only way they can make that happen is, of course, to demonstrate it as a concrete fact on the ground.
So, Mr. Guy Burton, you're of the view, although the STC has announced the self-rule and self-governance in the south, but the ground reality is that it would be very difficult for them to create a separate state on the lines that were before 1990s unification. Thank you for your time. I'm Mr. Guy Burton, Middle East expert, joined us from Brussels, and Mr. Adel, Dashela researcher from Istanbul, and Muhammad Alragawi, journalist in Yemen and media attaché in Ankara, joined us from Istanbul. With this, we come to the end of today's Newswire. With more in-depth analysis, we'll be back with you tomorrow. Till then, take good care.